Welcome to the Introduction to Transfer Pricing. It's a series of videos that we've created to teach some of the basic fundamentals of transfer pricing. Today's topic is an introduction to picking comparables for the comparable profits method, CPM, or the transactional net margin method. How to pick a comparable for a CPM analysis. As you may know from previous videos, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about trying to find a firm that is comparable to the party that we're going to call the tested party. And we're going to look at their profitability and compare the two and draw a conclusion that if the profitability of the tested party is approximately in the range of the profitability of the comparables, then that's an indication that the transfer price has not distorted their financial statement. So, to start off with, we'd love to start from the premise that you'd be able to find firms that are comparable to the tested party in every possible way except for the fact that their profitability is not affected by a related party transaction. So you'd want them to be completely comparable in all circumstances except that their transactions are all uncontrolled, meaning that they're not transacting with related parties, and so their profitability reflects the profitability that would be earned under normal economic conditions. Now, it's important to ask the question whether every single thing, every single item that might be a factor for comparability is as critically as important as any other. So, for example, just to give you an overview, if you were looking to buy a car and you were trying to compare two cars and they were the same make and the same model, the same year, they're both brand new, everything about them is the same except they have maybe two different color paints, you wouldn't expect that different paint to really have a very big effect on the overall price. So there are certain factors that might be very important and others that may not be. So when we're looking to find comparables, we want to make sure we're picking them based upon the most important factors. For example, a distributor of audio equipment would likely be very comparable to a distributor of video equipment. I say that in general. And if we think about it, it makes logical sense. These two distributors would probably have the same type of workforce, they'd be using the same kind of assets, and they'd be bearing relatively similar risks. So if you're looking at comparables and your tested party was an audio distributor and a comparable was a video distributor, that'd usually be a comparable you'd want to keep. So audio versus video, not typically a reason for rejection. If you notice, I've left myself a lot of outs here, not typically and in general. And that's because you can always think of situations where there is an exception. So for example, if your firm is an audio distributor and it happens to be that the time period we're looking at is at the invention of the compact disc, that would have a big effect on audio equipment distributors and is likely to have a relatively small effect on any video equipment distributor. Always an exception to the rule. So, obviously, if we could pick comparables that could come from the same industry, that would be preferable. We'd say they'd be affected by the exact same economic forces. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to look for observations outside of the same industry simply because there aren't enough observations within the industry. As we start to widen out the industries that we're going to consider, we have to think very carefully about why we would pick one versus another. The guiding principle would be to pick comparables that are driven by the same economic factors. So for our example, in general, an audio distribution equipment company is going to be driven by the same factors as people who distribute video equipment. But let's talk about some of the things that might not be so comparable. Retail distribution is actually quite different from wholesale distribution, so mixing these two sectors may be a bit of a problem. Retailers tend to have a lot of space, they've got to put things up on shelves and make it available to the public, whereas wholesalers tend to have a warehouse and they're just going to ship the product out to the retailers, and it's a much different business model. However, pretty much all wholesale distributors might be largely comparable, with a few industries that you might want to remove because they might be operating on a different business cycle, such as home building or agriculture. So one could think about having relatively large sets where the comparability factor is at a very high level, wholesale distribution. Similarly, probably all brick and mortar retail distribution might be in a general sense fairly comparable. However, these might not be comparable to, say, internet retailing, which is going to be looking a good bit operationally like a wholesale distributor with a logistic department for shipping the product out to customers. So again, one can think about these at a fairly high level. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and look at the other videos in this series about picking comparables and transfer pricing fundamentals.